So, we've looked at the effects of colonialism, slavery, and white supremacy. We've seen how these things have had a knock on effect socially, politically, and economically on the Black community. We've learned there is a historic mistrust of law enforcement and government based on past experiences with these predominantly white led systems. This brings us to contemporary issues surrounding the lives of Black people around the world. And to understand these issues, you had to understand the historic significance of the place Black people are coming from and the sphere they exist in. So, like I said in the very beginning, Black Lives Matter was founded in 2013 in America in response to the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's murderer. The Black Lives Matter Foundation is a global organization in the US, the UK, and Canada whose mission is to eradicate white supremacy and build local power to intervene in violence inflicted on Black communities by the state and vigilantes. The ethos behind Black Lives Matter is combating and countering acts of violence, creating space for Black imagination and innovation, and centering Black joy. The overall aim is to win immediate improvements in the lives of Black people. So let's go back to where it began. Trayvon Martin. Trayvon Benjamin Martin was a 17-year-old African American boy from Miami Gardens, Florida. One evening, Trayvon was at the house of his father's fiancée in Sanford, which is also in Florida. It's a predominantly white county. Trayvon's father and his fiancée had gone out, and Trayvon and the son of his father's fiancée were at home and they were just playing video games. Later that evening, Trayvon went out. He walked to a local 7-Eleven shop where he bought some Skittles. As Trayvon was returning from the shop back to the Twin Lakes neighborhood of Sanford where he was staying, George Zimmerman, a volunteer neighborhood watch person, spotted Trayvon. Zimmerman called Sanford police to report Trayvon as a suspicious person. There was an altercation between Trayvon and Zimmerman, and during that altercation, Trayvon was shot by Zimmerman and was killed. On the 10th of June 2013, Zimmerman's trial began in Sanford, and on the 13th of July, a jury acquitted him of second-degree murder and manslaughter charges. So what happened then? Well, following the acquittal of George Zimmerman, the hashtag Black Lives Matter was used on social media posts. This grew into a movement that became nationally recognised for street demonstrations following the 2014 deaths of two more African American men, Michael Brown in St. Louis and Eric Garner in New York City. So in the next few slides, we'll find out some more about Michael Brown and Eric Garner. Michael Brown Jr. was an 18-year-old African American boy from St. Louis, Missouri. 8 days before his death, he had graduated from Normandy High School in St. Louis County. At 11:50 a.m. on the 9th of August 2014, Mike Brown was recorded on camera with a friend stealing a box of Swisher Sweet cigars and forcefully shoving a Ferguson Market shop assistant. A police dispatcher reported a stealing in progress at the Ferguson Market and described the suspect as a black male wearing a white t-shirt running towards Quick Trip. A police officer by the name of Darren Wilson drove up to Michael and his friend as they were walking, and he ordered them to move off the street. There was an altercation in which a struggle took place between Michael and Officer Wilson, and Michael was left with a gunshot wound to his hand. So, following the scuffle that left Michael with the shot in his hand, Michael and his friend Dorian ran, and Dorian hid behind a car while Officer Wilson chased down Michael. At some point during the pursuit, Michael has stopped and turned to face Officer Wilson, at which point he fired his gun again while facing Michael, and he hit him with 6 shots. Michael Brown was unarmed and he died in the street. He was 18 years old. Less than 90 seconds had passed from the time Officer Wilson encountered Michael to the time of his death. 90 seconds. It all happened very, very quickly. Michael was shot at 12:02, and around 20 minutes after the shooting, Michael's dead body was covered in sheets by paramedics. Michael Brown's body was then taken away around 4 p.m., almost 4 hours after he had been killed. Local residents criticised authorities for leaving Michael's body out in the street for 4 hours in an action that was seen as demeaning and disrespectful. The shooting of Michael Brown by Officer Wilson sparked protests and riots on the 10th of August. This is known as the Ferguson Unrest or the Ferguson Riots. During this time, police established curfews and deployed riot squads to maintain order. Along with peaceful protests, there was significant looting and violent unrest in the vicinity of the original shooting, as well as across the city. A grand jury decided not to indict Officer Wilson for any criminal charges in relation to the incident. The unrest sparked a vigorous debate in the United States about the relationship between law enforcement officers and the African American community, the militarization of police, and the use of force law in Missouri and nationwide. Continued activism expanded the issues to include modern-day debtors' prisons, for-profit policing, and school segregation. This photo may look like a war zone, but is actually from the protest in Ferguson following the murder of Michael Brown. Eric Garner was a 44-year-old African-American man. Before having to quit his job for health reasons, he had been a horticulturist at the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation. He was the father of 6 children, he had 3 grandchildren, and at the time of his death, he had a 3-month-old child. Eric Garner had been arrested previously by the NYPD, more than 30 times in fact, since 1980, and the charges varied from assault, resisting arrest, and theft. On the 17th of July 2014, NYPD officers approached Eric Garner on suspicion of selling single cigarettes from packets without tax stamps. After Eric told the police that he was sick and tired of being harassed and that he was not selling cigarettes at all, the officers attempted to arrest him. An officer by the name of Daniel Pantaleo placed his hands on Eric, and Eric pulled his arms away. Officer Pantaleo then placed his arm around Eric's neck and wrestled him to the ground. Multiple officers backed up Officer Pantaleo, pinning Eric to the ground. Eric repeated the words, "I can't breathe," 11 times while pinned face down on the pavement for 7 minutes. Approximately 1 hour later, Eric Garner was pronounced dead at a local hospital. The medical examiner ruled Eric Garner's death a homicide. He was murdered. According to the medical examiner's definition, a homicide is a death caused by the intentional actions of another person or persons. Specifically, the autopsy indicated that Eric Garner's death resulted from compression of the neck, compression of the chest, and prone positioning during physical restraint by police. So Eric Garner died as a direct result of the chokehold he was put in, and despite his pleas of "I can't breathe," he was continued to be choked. The action was deliberate. So what happened next? Well, on the 4th of December 2014, a Richmond County grand jury decided not to indict Officer Pantaleo, and this decision led to public protests and rallies all around the United States. By the 28th of December 2014, at least 50 demonstrations had been held nationwide in direct response to the Eric Garner case, and hundreds of further demonstrations against general police brutality, citing Eric Garner as a focal point. On the 13th of July 2015, almost a year after Eric was murdered, it was announced that the City of New York would pay the Garner family $5.9 million in a settlement reached out of court. Then in 2019, the US Department of Justice declined to bring any criminal charges against Officer Pantaleo under federal civil rights laws. Instead, an NYPD disciplinary hearing regarding Officer Pantaleo's treatment of Eric Garner was held in the summer of 2019, and on the 2nd of August, an administrative judge recommended that Officer Pantaleo's employment be terminated. Officer Daniel Pantaleo was fired from the NYPD on the 19th of August 2019, more than 5 years after Eric Garner's death. So 3 African American men died, so what? Well, it's not just three, is it? Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, and Eric Garner are not isolated cases. Far from it. They just happen to be some of the most well publicized incidents. But these types of deaths of African American men and women at the hands of law enforcement is not new. It's been going on for decades, centuries even. Before it was the police, it was overseers. And before it was overseers, it was colonizers. The point is, the mistreatment of black lives by white people in authority, law enforcers in particular, is not new. America has a history of systemic racism against black people. And as we've seen in the majority of cases involving police brutality, there are little to no consequences for the officer or the officers accused.
The argument starts here with Trump's economic advisor saying this.
I don't believe nowadays we have systemic racism.
You said you don't believe systemic racism?
I do not.
At all in the U.S.?
I do not.
You don't think there's any systemic racism against African Americans in the United States?
I will say it again. I do not.
All right, this isn't believing in something like the tooth fairy. All right, it's about fact. He is wrong. It's not a matter of opinion. It's a matter of fact. And it is fact that you see everywhere you look in black and white. The immediate proof is in the cabinet. Trump has one black cabinet member and one black domestic policy advisor. Kudlow's the president's economic advisor. So let's start with the economy. White people make more money than blacks do, period, even if they have the same level of education, even if they're in the same jobs. In fact, that fundamental divide is as wide now as it was the year Dr. King was shot. So much for Trump's economy being the best ever for black people. Not relatively, and relativity matters. Black people are not only more likely to be unemployed, they're also more likely to be underemployed. For all Mr. Kudlow's talk about the stock market, blacks don't invest nearly as much as whites. Even when you include 401ks, systemic racism extends to government programs as well. Going back to the New Deal, the federal housing program that helped build the suburbs was often off limits to blacks. Lending practices, redlining, drawing an area around black neighborhoods, illegal, but their effects linger. Blacks are far less likely to own a home than whites, a gap that's only widened since 2004. And those that do buy a home have to put down more money, the equity cushion it's called, and they have to pay for a higher mortgage, meaning what? That even when banks do lend to them, they have tougher terms, even when similarly situated to whites. Then there's the question of how you get between work and home. The highway system, this may not seem like a big deal, but just think about it in terms of your existence. A marvel of American ingenuity by white America, but its design skipped over black neighborhoods. Even if there were as many on-ramps in their communities, many people of color are less likely to own a car because of income and credit challenges. Thus, they're more likely to depend on public transportation. We invest in buses and trains at a fraction of what we spend on the highway. So again, systemically, they are disserved. Then there's the question of what to do with your kids. Black families work more, and as we've seen, earn less. And what does that mean? It makes taking care of your kids harder. You don't have the time and you don't have the money. Childcare, tough decision. Once they get into the school system, and this is big, because this is all about the roadway to opportunity. The impact of history still hangs over their head. 58 years between Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal, and Brown versus the Board of Education mandating integration. That period wound up influencing how our school system works more arguably than the 62 years since the Little Rock Nine. And here's the proof for that suggestion. Districts with mostly students of color get $23 billion less in funding than white school districts, despite serving about the same number of kids. Less money means less power, right? Less pay for teachers, less access to extracurriculars and services and systems, right? We generally pay for schools with things like property taxes, right? And black communities can't support the kind of tax base that powers schools in many white communities. And even when you adjust for poverty, more is still spent on white students. Why? Systemic racism. Even how we discipline kids in schools is affected by systemic racism. How do we know? A white kid gets in trouble, a fight at school. The results often look like this. trip to the principal's office. Black kid gets in trouble at school, more likely to be disciplined. How? Suspended, wind up in juvenile justice. Why? Systemic racism, built into the fabric of the nation, as built in as the food we eat, the air we breathe, and the water we drink. Why? Because they are all worse in places of poverty. Remember Flint? The faces of that suffering? They still suffer today. The faces are still the same color. Even how we connect. It doesn't matter how much you get paid. If you're black, you got less access to the internet. It's quite literally a matter of life and death as well. Look at the coronavirus pandemic. Who's getting sick the most? Who's dying the most? Who are the largest percentage of essential workers working in the midst of this risk in our healthcare system? Minorities. And they're less likely to have insurance. They're less likely to have access to good care. They have more premature births. They have shorter life expectancy. They check more of the boxes of chronic conditions. The American Academy of Pediatrics last year identified the root cause of health problems over a lifetime is racism. Not race itself, the disparities caused by racism. Finally, the black community's ability to change these disparities should be through our democracy. But their voting rights are compromised. Gerrymandering, okay? Voter suppression. This is what Trump should be talking about, but he doesn't. Not mysterious illegals, but real legalities, like we arguably just saw in Atlanta. And then, yes, there is policing. I don't say the police, because this is about more than people or bad apples. It's about the orchard. It's about the system. And again, systemic policies and tactics that work against blacks disproportionately. Cops are more likely to pull over black drivers, even when you adjust for daytime and nighttime stops that may make it hard to tell who's driving. People of color are more likely to be searched while stopped, even though whites are more likely to actually have drugs on them. Our prisons, overcrowded, filled with a disproportionate number of black faces, harsher sentences, less effective counsel, more police encounters in their communities. That's what you get, more in the prisons. Blacks are more likely to have the cops called on them. Officers are more likely to use force on them. And while the vast majority of the time those cases don't make the news and don't end with those losing their lives, it still happens. And when someone does die at the hands of a police officer, they are more likely to be black. Two reasons someone like Larry Kudlow would say they don't see systemic racism in this country. One, because in his world, he doesn't see it. But I believe the real reason is he's following Trump protocol. Lie, deny, and defy. Trump is not the first to play this division in our society. As I just argued it, it is built in. The challenge is to change it, and that is going to require something that Kudlow, Trump, and co. don't appear to have: the will to create a more perfect union.
You might not have heard of Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, or Eric Garner, but I know you've heard of George Floyd. The recent murder of George Floyd caused outrage because the whole world watched a man die at the hands of the police. It resonated with people around the world because many black people in America and around the world feel targeted by law enforcement. And these images resonated because in George Floyd, they didn't just see an African American man, they saw themselves. As stated on the previous slide, racism aimed at black people by law enforcement isn't new, but now technology is available that captures it, and with the internet, it can now be shown to the world, which is why you probably see and hear more about it than you did in the past. These are just some of the names of people killed in the US either by racially motivated attacks or at the hands of law enforcement. They were someone's brother, someone's sister, someone's child, someone's parent, someone's friend. Above all, they were someone. Please don't be fooled into thinking this is just an American problem, because it's not. In fact, Europeans, and Great Britain in particular, has a lot to be held accountable for. Who colonised America? In fact, who colonised almost a quarter of the land on the planet? Who was one of the biggest players in the transatlantic slave trade and made a lot of their wealth from the enslavement and forced labour of black people? So let's take a look at some issues closer to home. We've already looked at the riots of 1919. Now let's look at something that happened in the lifetime of people you might know. The Brixton riots happened between the 10th and 12th of April 1981 and was a confrontation between the Metropolitan Police and black protesters in Brixton, South London. Yep, the UK. The main riot on the 11th of April was dubbed Bloody Saturday by Time magazine after it resulted in 29 injuries to police and 45 injuries to members of the public. Around 5,000 people were involved in the riots and 82 arrests were made. Over 100 vehicles were set alight, including 56 police vehicles. Almost 150 buildings were damaged, with 30 sustaining fire damage. At the time, Brixton was not the gentrified, trendy hipster hangout that it is now. In 1981, Brixton was an area with serious social and economic problems. It was predominantly an Afro-Caribbean community that at the time was suffering particularly high unemployment, poor housing, and a higher than average crime rate as the country experienced a recession. In the months before the riots, there had been a growing unease between the inhabitants of the borough of Lambeth, which is the borough in which Brixton is, and the police. In January 1981, a number of black youths had died in a fire during a house party in New Cross, and the authorities had claimed that it may have been an accidental fire that was started from inside the house. However, within the local community, it was widely suspected that it was a racially motivated arson attack by someone outside of the property. The police investigation was criticised as inadequate as it did not explore that possibility and it generally just ruled it out. Black people in South London were not happy with how the police dealt with the fire in New Cross, and they believed it wasn't investigated properly because the people involved were black. On the 2nd of March 1981, black activists organised a march for the Black People's Day of Action. The march was attended by 5,000 to 25,000 people, and they walked the 17 miles from Deptford to Hyde Park, passing the Houses of Parliament. The majority of the march finished in Hyde Park without any issues, but there was some confrontation with police around Blackfriars in central London. Professor Les Black wrote that while the local press reported the march respectfully, the national papers unloaded the full weight of racial stereotyping. For example, the Evening Standard's front page headline was a photo of a policeman with a bloody face next to a quote from Dark as Hell, referring to the march as a good day. A few weeks later, some of the organisers of the march were arrested and charged with the offence of rioting. They were later acquitted. It's worth mentioning here that to this day, the media continue to manipulate headlines and report things in a way that make people of colour, especially black people, appear in a negative light. Sometimes it's in the headlines, but often it's in the language that they use when describing black people and white people. For example, the recent BLM marches in London, a lot of the news reports referred to the people at the protest as rioters and thugs, despite it being an inclusive, largely peaceful protest. However, a week later at the EDL march, where a man openly urinated on the memorial of PC Keith Palmer, the white protesters were not referred to as rioters or thugs, despite being drunk, openly attacking police officers and acting unruly. Also, another thing I feel worth mentioning in relation to the protest by the EDL is that following the murder of George Floyd, Black Lives Matter marches happened in 60 countries all over the world. There was a protest on every continent except Antarctica. Do you know how many countries had an anti-protest in response to the BLM protests? Just one, just the UK. So here we have a few pictures. On the left, you can see an original poster for the People's Day of Action demonstration. And in the middle, top and bottom, you can see two photos from the protest. And on the right, we have some pictures from newspapers at the time reporting the protest. So you have the National Front News reporting it as the Great Terror, implying black people are to be feared. And underneath we have the Sun's headline, "To think this is England," which again implies that black people, or in this case their actions, lower the tone of the whole country. Okay, so back to the Brixton riots. The Black People's Day of Action happened and nothing really changed. At the beginning of April 1981, the Metropolitan Police began Operation Swamp 81. Operation Swamp 81 was a plainclothes operation to reduce crime and got its name from Margaret Thatcher's assertion that the UK might be rather swamped by people of a different culture. At this time, uniform patrols were also increased in the area. Officers from other metropolitan police districts and the Special Patrol Group were also dispatched into Brixton, and within 5 days, 943 people had been stopped and searched, with 82 arrests made. Powers under the Vagrancy Act of 1824 allowed police to search and arrest members of the public when they believed that they were acting suspiciously, although not necessarily committing a crime. They became known as sus laws, and the Afro-Caribbean community claimed that the police were disproportionately using these powers against Black people. On Friday the 10th of April 1981 at around 5:15 p.m, a police officer spotted a young black man named Michael Bailey. Michael was running towards him away from three other black youths. The police officer stopped Michael and found he was bleeding badly, but Michael broke away from the policeman and continued to run. Michael was stopped again on Atlantic Road and was found to have a 4-inch stab wound. Michael Bailey ran into a flat, and there he was helped by a family and the police officer. They put wadded up kitchen roll on the wound and applied pressure to slow the bleeding. As this was happening, a crowd began to gather, and they quickly got angry, believing that the police weren't getting help for Michael quickly enough. The police officer got back up and tried to transport Michael to the hospital in a police car, but as he tried to get him in the car, the crowd saw and thought he was being arrested, and this caused small groups to start pushing and shoving, and that escalated into fighting. The following day, word got around the local community that Michael had died, and they believed it was a result of police brutality, and this fueled tensions throughout the day as crowds slowly gathered. Around 4 p.m, 2 police officers stopped and searched a minicab on Railton Road. By this time, Brixton High Street was reportedly filled with angry people, and bricks were being thrown at police cars. Within an hour, tensions escalated, and that only spread into the following hours. By 9 p.m, the 9 o'clock news on the BBC was reporting that shops had been looted and 46 police officers had been injured, 5 seriously. The police put out emergency calls to police officers across London asking for assistance. They had no strategy, which was compounded by ineffective protective equipment such as inadequate helmets and non-fireproof plastic shields that barely protected them as they proceeded to clear the streets of rioters. They did this by pushing the rioters down the road and forming deep shield walls. The rioters responded to this with bricks, bottles, and petrol bombs. The riots in Brixton ended, but between the 3rd and the 11th of July of that year, around the country there was more unrest fueled by racial and social discord. Handsworth in Birmingham, Southall in London, Toxteth in Liverpool, Hyson Green in Nottingham, and Moss Side in Manchester all saw unrest. There were also smaller pockets of unrest in Leeds, Leicester, Southampton, Halifax, Bedford, Gloucester, Wolverhampton, Coventry, Bristol, and Edinburgh. Racial tension played a major part in most of these disturbances, although all of the riots took place in areas hit particularly hard by unemployment and recession. So, why are the Brixton riots still relevant? Well, let's start with the fact that police in Britain still use stop and search, and black people are stopped at a greater rate than white people or people of any other ethnicity. Between April 2018 and March 2019, there were 375,588 stop and searches in England and Wales, not including vehicle searches. There were 4 stop and searches for every 1,000 white people, compared with 38 for every 1,000 black people. That's over 9 times more, and almost half of all stop and searches took place in the Metropolitan Police Force area in London. So, although Brixton was 39 years ago, on the surface it seems very little has changed. Five years after the Brixton riot, there was another major riot in London, this time north of the river in Tottenham. The Broadwater Farm riot occurred on the Broadwater Council estate in Tottenham, North London, on the 6th of October 1985. The riot was triggered by two deaths: Cynthia Jarrett, an Afro-Caribbean woman who died the previous day due to heart failure during a police search at her home, and the shooting of a black woman named Dorothy Cherry Gross during another police search in Brixton the previous week. Tensions between local black youth and the largely white Metropolitan Police was already high. Actually, some of you may have heard of a grime MC named Scorcher. Well, Cynthia Jarrett was actually his grandmother, and he was born 6 months after her death. On the 5th of October 1985, a young black man by the name of Floyd Jarrett was arrested by police after being stopped in a vehicle with an allegedly suspicious car tax disc. Floyd was taken to nearby Tottenham police station, and there he was charged with theft and assault. Charges he was later acquitted of. Anyway, 5.5 hours later, an officer named DC Randall and three other officers went to search the home of Floyd's mother, Cynthia. 49-year-old Mrs. Jarrett immediately collapsed and died after suffering a heart attack during disputed circumstances. Some said the heart attack was brought on by stress related to the search. Others claimed it was completely unrelated. Regardless, Cynthia Jarrett's death sparked outrage within the black community, many of whom already believed the Metropolitan Police were institutionally racist. On the 6th of October 1985, there was a small demonstration outside Tottenham Police Station, but violence broke out between police and youths. This violence escalated during the day as riot police tried to clear the streets using baton charges. The youths involved in the conflict used bricks and petrol bombs, which resulted in many injuries as well as extensive damage to property and vehicles. That evening, the news claimed there were shots at the police and that two officers were being treated for gunshot wounds. 3 journalists were also claimed to have been hit. Cars were set on fire and barricades made. One house in particular on the edge of the estate was severely damaged by fire. However, the main conflict between police and rioters took place in the centre of the estate itself. Many were injured on both sides and dozens of rioters were arrested. The conflict continued throughout the evening, and around 9:30 p.m. the police and the fire brigade responded to reports of a fire on an elevated level of one of the buildings. The location itself was some distance away from the main body of the rioting, and because of this it was being policed by smaller units who were less well equipped and prepared in terms of disorder training. The police and fire brigade came under attack. An officer by the name of PC Blakelock had been there to assist, and he got caught up in the attack. The rioting was too intense for police not trained in riot control, so the police and firefighters withdrew, but then they were chased by rioters. While running, PC Blakelock tripped, fell, and ended up surrounded by a mob with machetes, knives, and other weapons. This mob killed and attempted to decapitate him. Another police officer by the name of PC Richard Coombs suffered a serious facial injury from one of the attackers as he made efforts to rescue his colleague. As the night drew on, the rioting tailed off, but news of PC Blakelock's death began to spread. 6 people, 3 adults and 3 juveniles, were charged with the murder of PC Blakelock. The juveniles all had their cases dismissed after the judge ruled that the conditions in which they had been held were so inappropriate that their interrogation was inadmissible. These conditions included being questioned naked except for a blanket and being questioned without a guardian. In March 1987, 3 local men, Winston Silcott, Engin Ragkip, and Mark Braithwaite, were convicted of the murder of PC Blakelock and sentenced to life in prison, despite there being no witnesses and no forensic evidence. They became known as the Tottenham Three, and campaigns such as the Tottenham Three Are Innocent campaign and the Broadwater Farm Defence campaign pressed for retrial. On the 25th of November 1991, all 3 defendants were cleared by the Court of Appeal, when the ESDA test demonstrated police notes of interrogations, which at the time was the only evidence available, had actually been tampered with. Mark Braithwaite and Engin Raghip were released after serving 4 years in prison. Winston Silcott remained in prison for the separate murder of another man, which occurred in the Tottenham area prior to the riot on Broadwater Farm. Winston Silcott was released on licence in October 2003 after serving 18 years in prison, despite a recommendation of a 14-year minimum being issued by the trial judge. There was an investigation into the officer in charge of the interrogation of the Tottenham Three, and that officer was then cleared of perjury. On July 2013, a man named Nicholas Jacobs was charged with the murder of PC Blakelock. 4 other men were arrested at the same time, but were not charged. On the 9th of April 2014, Nicholas Jacobs was cleared of all charges. Suffice to say, the black community in the UK have also had their share of issues with law enforcement, so by now you can see that this is not an issue that's isolated to the United States. Sadly, racism is something people deal with every day, whether it be overt, such as racially aggravated incident, or subconscious, such as any number of microaggressions that seem to just be a way of life for people of colour. And there is a spectrum. Many light-skinned people of colour benefit from their own privilege of not being a darker complexion, and some might even be able to pass for white. Issues of colorism are real within the black community, but being black on the whole makes you an easier target because you cannot hide. With many other forms of discrimination regarding religion or sexuality, for example, it's not always obvious, and in some circumstances, people have the option of denial. But it's hard to deny being black when it's something that, on the whole, is quite obvious. So, with all that said, let's keep it moving. Who is Stephen Lawrence? Well, Stephen Lawrence was a black British 19-year-old man from Plumstead, southeast London. In 1993, Stephen was murdered in a racially motivated attack while waiting for a bus in Wellhall in Eltham. Stephen's parents were Jamaican and had emigrated to the UK in the 1960s. His father, Neville Lawrence, was then a carpenter, and his mother, Doreen, was then a special needs teacher. At the time of his death, Stephen was studying technology and physics at Blackheath Bluecoat School and English language and literature at Woolwich College. When he grew up, he was hoping to become an architect. On Thursday the 22nd of April 1993, Stephen had spent the day at school, and after school, like most teenagers, he went to the shops. Then from there he went to his uncle's house. While he was at his uncle's house, his friend Dwayne came over to play video games, and around 10 p.m. they left together to go home. Nothing extraordinary, just typical teenage boys. They got on the bus, but realised the bus they were on would get them home very late. Remember, this is before mobile phones and smartphones and all of that, so they couldn't check the bus timetable beforehand. So they ended up getting off the bus and they changed for a different route that would get them home sooner. So at around 10:25, Stephen and Dwayne arrived at the bus stop on Wellhall Road. Stephen walked a little way down the road to the junction to see if the bus was coming. And it was at this point that Dwayne saw a group of 5 or 6 white youths crossing over from the opposite side of the street and moving towards him and Stephen. Dwayne called out to ask Stephen if he saw the bus coming, and he said he heard one of the white youths say, what, nigger?" as they quickly crossed the road and surrounded Stephen. The group attacked Stephen, forcing him to the ground, where they beat him and stabbed him to a depth of about 13 centimetres on both sides of the front of his body, in the right collarbone and in the left shoulder. Both of the wounds severed arteries before penetrating a lung. Stephen lost all feeling in his right arm and his breathing was constricted, which isn't surprising. After all, he had been stabbed in his lung. He was losing blood at a rapid rate from 4 major blood vessels. Dwayne began running, and he shouted for Stephen to get up and to run to escape with him. Meanwhile, the attackers ran off down the road while Dwayne and Stephen ran in the opposite direction. Stephen managed to run about 120 metres before collapsing. He bled to death shortly afterwards. An off-duty police officer saw Stephen and got out of his car to assist, while Dwayne ran to call for an ambulance. Stephen was taken to Brooke General Hospital, but unfortunately he was already dead. In the days that followed Stephen's murder, several local residents came forward to provide names of suspects, and an anonymous note was left on a police car windscreen and in a telephone box naming a local gang as the 5 main suspects. The suspects' names that were given were Gary Dobson, brothers Neil and Jamie Acortt, Luke Knight, and David Norris. The 5 suspects were previously involved in racist knife attacks around the Eltham area and were known by police. Within 3 days of the crime, prime suspects had been identified. No arrests were made, however, until 2 weeks after the murder. Detective Superintendent Brian Whedon, the officer who had been leading the murder investigation, said that part of the reason no arrests had taken place by the 4th day after the killing was that he had not known the law allowed arrest upon reasonable suspicion. Now, Joe Public might not be a police officer or a lawyer, so may not know that arrest upon reasonable suspicion is a basic point of criminal law. But if your job involves arresting people, that should probably be something that you're aware of, right? On the 7th of May 1993, the Acortt brothers and Dobson were arrested. David Norris turned himself in to the police and was likewise arrested 3 days later. Luke Knight was arrested almost a month later on the 3rd of June. Neil Acortt and Luke Knight were charged with murder on the 13th of May and 23rd of June 1993 respectively, but the charges were dropped by the CPS on the 29th of July 1993, citing insufficient evidence. In February 1997, an inquest into the death of Stephen Lawrence was held, and the 5 suspects refused to answer any questions, claiming privilege against self-incrimination. The inquest concluded on the 13th of February 1997, with the jury returning a verdict after just 30 minutes of deliberation. The verdict was of unlawful killing in a completely unprovoked racist attack by 5 white youths. This finding went beyond the bounds of their instructions. In 2002, David Norris and Neil Acortt were convicted and jailed for racially aggravated harassment after an incident involving a plainclothes black police officer. Then, between 2011 and 2012, there was a trial in which Gary Dobson and David Norris were found guilty of the murder of Stephen Lawrence, 19 years after Stephen was murdered. Sean Rigg was a 40-year-old black British musician and music producer who suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. On the 21st of August 2008, Sean died following a cardiac arrest while in police custody at the entrance to Brixton Police Station in South London. Sean's case gained publicity when civil rights and justice campaigners in the UK called for improvement and change on a national level regarding deaths in police custody and the police treatment of suspects with mental health issues. So for context, the Brixton riots were in 1981. Sean Rigg died in the same area 27 years later while in custody of the police. On the surface, it would seem that in 27 years, relations between the police and the black community of Brixton had not really changed. Sean lived in a hostel for people with a forensic mental health history, and following deterioration in his mental health, had become uncooperative and aggressive. The day he died, 5999 calls were made over a 3-hour period by the staff at the hostel where he lived. Calls in which they requested emergency assistance from the police in dealing with Sean. During the 5th call, an operator named Maurice Gluck insisted that Sean wasn't a police priority and informed the caller to speak with her MP if she was unhappy. He then terminated the call. Eventually, the police did respond, but that was only when members of the public who observed Sean's strange behaviour in the street called them to report it. Police arrived at the scene and 4 police officers ended up chasing Sean. When Sean was caught, he was handcuffed and restrained in a face-down position as officers leant on him for 8 minutes. Sean was arrested for assaulting a police officer for public disorder and theft of a passport. The passport was actually Sean's own passport and was not at all stolen property. When Sean was arrested, he was placed face down with his legs bent behind him in the caged rear section of a police van, and he was transported to Brixton Police Station. During this journey to the police station, Sean's mental and physical health deteriorated, and he became extremely unwell and not fully conscious. So at this point, Sean was extremely unwell and semi-conscious when eventually he was taken out of the van. Two officers carried him to the entrance of the police station's custody suite, where he was left placed on the floor, handcuffed and unresponsive. One of the arresting officers was captured on the station CCTV, claiming that Sean was faking it. Sean was examined after 35 minutes by a forensic medical examiner who found that his heart had stopped and he was not breathing. Although CPR was attempted, Sean was officially pronounced dead after arriving at King's College Hospital in Southwark. The Independent Police Complaints Commission launched an investigation into Sean Riggs' death on the 22nd of August 2008. The investigation took 18 months to complete and concluded that there was no evidence of neglect or wrongdoing and that the police had acted reasonably and proportionately. In August 2012, an inquest jury at Southwark Coroner's Court returned a narrative verdict which concluded that the police had used unsuitable and unnecessary force on Sean Rigg and that officers had failed to uphold his basic rights, and that the failings of the police more than minimally contributed to his death. The inquest highlighted serious shortfalls in the IPCC's investigation, while South London and Maudsley NHS Foundation Trust were also criticised for failing to organise a mental health assessment for Sean and failing to ensure that he took his medication. Sean was not a criminal, he was a sick man who needed help, and the people called to help him contributed to his death. Mark Duggan was a 29-year-old man of mixed Irish and Caribbean heritage. Mark grew up on Broadwater Farm, North London, the same estate that saw rioting in 1985. Mark was the father of 6 children, the youngest of whom was born after his death. He worked at Stansted Airport and was hoping for a career change after he had applied to become a firefighter. Officers from Operation Trident had had Mark Duggan under surveillance. The police had suspected that Mark was planning to commit a crime in retaliation for the killing of his cousin, Kevin Easton, who had been stabbed to death outside of a bar in East London in March of 2011. Around 6:15 on the 4th of August 2011, police stopped a minicab which was carrying Mark Duggan as a passenger. The area in which the cab was stopped had no CCTV coverage, and some witnesses alleged that police chased away any onlookers. According to an unnamed firearms officer, Mark Duggan pivoted out of the cab and pulled a self-loading pistol or handgun from his waistband. However, according to the minicab driver who had been driving the cab, Mark had left the cab and had run. He only managed to get 2 or 3 feet from the cab before he was shot. The cab driver also told the inquest that Mark had fallen to the ground and was being handled harshly and callously by the officers, and that an armed officer had threatened to shoot him, the cab driver, if he didn't stop looking at where Mark had fallen to the ground and how the officers were treating him. The police fired twice, hitting Mark Duggan in the bicep and in the chest. Paramedics from the London Ambulance Service and medical staff from London's Air Ambulance Service attended, but Mark Duggan was pronounced dead at the scene. The police who shot Mark Duggan were part of a specialist firearms command accompanying officers from Operation Trident. After Mark's death, the police did not inform Mark's family of his death until a day and a half after he was killed. They found out about his death from the news. Following the shooting, police proceeded to move the taxi in which Mark had been travelling. After some dispute over when the vehicle was moved, it was stated that police moved the taxi for examination and then returned it to the scene. A local equality advocate said the IPCC initially had no knowledge of these events, but later stated that it had sanctioned removal of the vehicle and then requested that it be restored to the scene. In an initial short form report of the incident, filed by an officer identified as W70, the report did not say that Mark Duggan had raised a gun. However, W70 filed another report 48 hours later which described Mark as drawing a gun from his waistband. Officer W70 later testified that short form reports are deliberately brief, despite the act of drawing a gun from his waistband seeming like critical information for the report. Initially, a spokesman for the IPCC stated that they understand an officer was shot first before Mark Duggan was shot. Police later called this statement a mistake. Tottenham's MP David Lammy stated Mark's death occurred as part of a history in Tottenham that involves deaths in police custody. Claudia Webb, the chairperson for Operation Trident, asserted that many black people see Mark Duggan's shooting as yet another unjust death in custody, and that young black people in Tottenham are still 6, 7, 8 times more likely to be stopped and searched than their white counterparts. Black British novelist Alex Wheatle, who served a term in prison for crimes he committed in the 1981 Brixton riots, asserted that there was a deep aggravation that despite many black deaths in police custody, there had never been a conviction of a police officer. On the 6th of August 2011, 26 years after the Broadwater Farm riots, Mark Duggan's relatives and local community marched from Broadwater Farm to Tottenham Police Station. The demonstrators chanted, "We want answers," and requested information from police about the circumstances of Mark's death. They also made broader demands for justice, seeking to publicise ongoing poor relations with police in their community. A chief inspector came out of the station and spoke to the demonstrators, who demanded to see a higher ranking officer. Around 8 p.m, a 16-year-old girl approached a police officer and may have thrown something at him. There is a dispute in accounts. Some say she threw a leaflet and some say she threw a stone. Either way, police officers swarmed the teenage girl with shields and batons and allegedly caused head injuries. Members of the waiting crowd attacked 2 nearby police cars, setting them on fire. According to Police Commander Adrian Hanstock, the violence was started by certain elements who were not involved in the vigil. Other observers present stated that the rally began peacefully but was incited by the police attack. The unrest turned into full-blown rioting. In the days that followed, rioting, arson and looting spread to other parts of London and to elsewhere in the UK. Rioters expressed mixed motivations for rioting, including policing issues, poverty, and racial tension with police. Mark Duggan's family condemned the disorder. His older brother said, "We're not condoning any kind of actions like that at all." So hopefully now you see and understand this is not just an American issue. The UK too faces the same tensions between the black community and law enforcement. The black community in the UK and throughout Europe face similar issues as the black community in the United States in regards to racism, poverty, and employment. Mark Duggan, Sean Rigg, and Stephen Lawrence, as I've been saying this whole presentation, are not isolated incidents. Here are a list of some of the names of individuals who have lost their lives in the UK, either at the hands of the police or from racially motivated attacks. They were somebody's brother, sister, uncle, auntie, somebody's child, somebody's parent, somebody's friend. They were somebody. A lot of you might be asking, why riot? Why loot? Well, for centuries, black people have been opposed. What do you do when you don't feel seen or heard? When you're voiceless? What do you do when the same thing keeps happening over and over again? What do you do when social contracts are broken? Who do you go to when the people who are supposed to protect and serve you are complicit in killing people who look like you? Violence is not the answer. Violence is not the solution. I think most people would agree on that. But have you ever been pushed and pushed and pushed until you can't take any more and your only response is anger? The only response is rage. It's like if you keep poking someone constantly, just poking them, irritating them, at some point that person's they're going to say they've had enough. They're going to refuse to take it anymore. And the likelihood is they're probably going to try and hit you back. As for the looting, when you feel you have nothing, therefore you have nothing to lose, then looting may provide an opportunity to get things that normally you'd never be able to afford. That is a poverty issue. It's not necessarily a race issue. The two, unfortunately, are synonymous, but they're not mutually exclusive. Poverty may disproportionately affect the black community, but poverty is colorblind. No one is denying that there are white people who also live in poverty. The difference is they still benefit from white privilege. And by that I mean they may still suffer the effects of poverty. They've probably endured struggles and life probably hasn't been easy, but their life hasn't been made harder by the colour of their skin. I'm not here to justify any actions or defend any actions, but hopefully you can see why it results in rioting and why it results in looting. Also, please note that a lot of the violence at demonstrations is not caused by people who are there for the cause. Similarly, a lot of the time the looting is not being done by people who are there for the cause. As with anything, there is always a small number of opportunistic people who thrive on making trouble. People who would see an opportunity to loot and take it, and these people come in all ages, all races, all ethnicities.
So I've been seeing a lot of things talking of the people making commentary. Interestingly enough, the ones I've noticed that have been making the commentary are wealthy black people making the commentary about we should not be rioting, we should not be looting, we should not be tearing up our own communities. And then there's been an argument of the other side of we should be hitting them in the pocket. We should be focusing on the blackout days where we don't spend money. But, you know, I feel like we should do both. And I feel like I support both. And I'll tell you why I support both. I support both because when you have a civil unrest like this, there are three types of people in the streets. There are the protesters, there are the rioters, and there are the looters. The protesters are there because they actually care about what is happening in the community. They want to raise their voices and they are there strictly to protest. You have the rioters who are angry, who are anarchists, who really just want to shit up, and that's what they're going to do regardless. And then you have the looters. And the looters almost exclusively are just there to do that, to loot. Now, people are like, well, what did you gain? Well, what did you get from looting? I think that as long as we're focusing on the what, we're not focusing on the why, and that's my issue with that. As long as we're focusing on what they're doing, we're not focusing on why they're doing. And some people are like, well, those aren't people who are legitimately angry about what's happening. Those are people who just want to get stuff. Okay, well then, let's go with that. Let's say that's what it is. Let's ask ourselves why in this country in 2020, the financial gap between poor blacks and the rest of the world is at such a distance that people feel like their only hope and only opportunity to get some of the things that we flaunt and flash in front of them all the time is to walk through a broken glass window and get it. That they are so hopeless that getting that necklace, getting that TV, getting that change, getting that bed, getting that phone, whatever it is that they're going to get, is that in that moment when the riots happen and if they present an opportunity of looting, that's their only opportunity to get it. We need to be questioning that why. Why are people that poor? Why are people that broke? Why are people that food insecure, that clothing insecure, that they feel like their only shot, that they are shooting their shot by walking through a broken glass window to get what they need. And then people want to talk about, well, there's plenty of people who pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and got it on their own. Why can't they do that? Let me explain to you something about economics in America. And I'm so glad that as a child, I got an opportunity to spend time at Push where they taught me this, is that we must never forget that economics was the reason that black people were brought to this country. We came to do the agricultural work in the South and the textile work in the North. Do you understand that? That's what we came to do. We came to do the agricultural work in the South and the textile work in the North. Now, if I right now decided that I wanted to play Monopoly with you, and for 400 rounds of playing Monopoly, I didn't allow you to have any money, I didn't allow you to have anything on the board, I didn't allow for you to have anything, and then we played another 50 rounds of Monopoly, and everything that you gained and you earned while you were playing that round of Monopoly was taken from you. That was Tulsa, that was Rosewood. Those are places where we built black economic wealth, where we were self-sufficient, where we owned our stores, where we owned our property, and they burned them to the ground. So that's 450 years. So for 400 rounds of Monopoly, you don't get to play at all. Not only do you not get to play, you have to play on the behalf of the person that you're playing against. You have to play and make money and earn wealth for them, and then you have to turn it over to them. So then for 50 years, you finally get a little bit and you're allowed to play. And every time that they don't like the way that you're playing, or that you're catching up, or that you're doing something to be self-sufficient, they burn your game. They burn your cards. They burn your Monopoly money. And then finally at the release and the onset of that, they allow you to play and they say, okay, now you catch up. Now at this point, the only way you're going to catch up in the game is if the person shares the wealth, correct? But what if every time you share the wealth, then there's psychological warfare against you to say, oh, you're an equal opportunity hire. So if I played 400 rounds of Monopoly with you and I had to play and give you every dime that I made, and then for 50 years, every time that I played, if you didn't like what I did, you got to burn it like they did in Tulsa and like they did in Rosewood, how can you win? How can you win? You can't win. The game is fixed. So when they say, why do you burn down the community? Why do you burn down your own neighborhood? It's not ours. We don't own anything. We don't own anything. Trevor Noah said it so beautifully last night. There's a social contract that we all have, that if you steal or if I steal, then the person who is the authority comes in and they fix the situation. But the person who fixes the situation is killing us. So the social contract is broken. And if the social contract is broken, why the f do I give a shit about burning the Football Hall of Fame, about burning the Target? You broke the contract when you killed us in the streets and didn't give a f. You broke the contract when for 400 years we played your game and built your wealth. You broke the contract when we built our wealth again on our own, by our bootstraps in Tulsa, and you dropped bombs on us. When we built it in Rosewood and you came in and you slaughtered us. You broke the contract, so f your Target, f your Hall of Fame. As far as I'm concerned, they could burn this bitch to the ground. And it still wouldn't be enough. And they are lucky that what black people are looking for is equality and not revenge.
If you've seen the news at all in the past few months, you will know that many statues commemorating the Confederacy and memorializing slave traders and slave masters have been removed, either willingly by officials or by force by protesters. This raises the question, is removal of statues erasing history? In my opinion, you can't erase history. History has already happened, and removing statues by no means changes what has gone in the past. Generally speaking, statues are used to commemorate someone. When someone has done something great, usually there would be a statue so we and future generations remember that great person and the great things they did. Bearing that in mind, the reason a lot of people want to see statues removed is that a lot of statues that have been removed have been of oppressors, people who inflicted trauma on Black people. For context, it would be like being a victim of a sexual assault and then having your abuser being honoured and commemorated. Germany played a part in one of the most infamous Holocausts in history. It's so infamous that we refer to it as the Holocaust, and immediately people know which Holocaust you're referring to. And guess what? You won't find a statue of Adolf Hitler in Germany. And do you know why? Because he committed atrocities against the Jewish people and he should not be commemorated. He should not be celebrated. It was a traumatic part of Jewish history, and Jewish people living in or even visiting Germany should not have to walk past a statue of Adolf Hitler, and they don't. By definition, the transatlantic slave trade was a holocaust of African men, women, and children. It was a destruction, a slaughter of African men, women, and children. It was a traumatic period in the history of people from the African diaspora. Yet many people think it's fine to keep up statues of slave traders, of slave owners, and Confederate generals who fought to keep slavery. And the Black community, descendants of the people who were brutally treated, like raped, tortured, denied basic human rights, their descendants who live in the places where these statues still exist have to look at these people being celebrated, being commemorated like heroes. So is there a place for remembering these people? Of course there is. History has already happened, but the only way not to repeat mistakes that we made in the past is to learn and grow from them. There is no point denying these things happen. That serves no one. A proper place for remembering these people and the part they played in history would be in a museum, for example. The statues could be put in museums, and if their contribution to history is incorporated into school curriculum and properly taught, then people get a better, fuller picture and a better understanding than simply celebrating and glorifying someone in stone, iron, or bronze with no context. The stance on statues is a complex and often polarizing one. Some people feel strongly for them and others feel strongly against. Everything I've expressed is my own opinion. It's neither right nor it's wrong. It's just how I feel. And if you don't agree with me, that's fine. It's fine to have a different opinion. You're entitled to that. The whole point of this presentation is primarily to educate in certain things you might not have been fully aware of, but it's also to make you think and to start a dialogue. Okay, so over this journey, I have taken a painstakingly long time to break down key incidents into digestible segments. Please do not assume this is Black history. Black history is and does not start with slavery and end with George Floyd and the continued injustices that Black people face. That is not Black history. Black history is a beautiful, colourful, and proud history that is not defined nor weighted down by the shackles of slavery. So if you've been paying attention to the million times I've stated that it's not just an American problem, it's a society problem. So how can we change it? What can we do as individuals to help? First, we can start by admitting and acknowledging there is a problem. If you're white, you can acknowledge that white privilege does exist and you have benefited from it, whether you're aware of it or not. Don't forget, white privilege does not mean you are racist. It doesn't mean your life has been easy. It doesn't mean you don't face struggles too. It just means that your life hasn't been made harder by the colour of your skin. So acknowledge that. Do not take it as a personal attack, because it's not. Just have some empathy. We can address our own implicit or subconscious bias. I'll explain in a minute what that means, but don't just assume that you can't be racist because you have a Black friend, a Black cat, a Black gerbil, whatever. Just because you know Black people does not mean that you don't have a subconscious bias. Educate yourself. You've made it through this, so you're definitely making moves in the right direction, but go further. Read a book, watch a documentary. Don't think what you were taught in school is the sum total of history, because it isn't. You can support Black-owned businesses. That's as simple as going to your local Caribbean takeaway and buying a patty, to buying from any number of black businesses online in your area. Talk to your black friends. Talk to them. Don't expect them to teach you their history. That's not their job. That's your job to educate yourself. But talk to them about their experiences or how they feel when they see incidents like what happened to George Floyd. It might not be a comfortable conversation, but take that step. And well, if you don't have a black friend to have that conversation with, then you need to ask yourself why. Go on a protest. If you support the cause, show up. Be an ally. You don't have to be black to believe that Black Lives Matter. If you're able to, why not donate to a charity that helps the black community in your local area? Donating doesn't have to mean financial donations. You could volunteer your time, and I'm sure they will be very grateful. Write to your MP. Find out their stance on racism towards black people and how they would address this in a practical way. And remember that response when you go to vote. MPs represent you. If your MP's views do not align with your own, then maybe they don't deserve your vote. Finally, if you're of age, vote. Vote, 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 vote. I can't say it enough. In the UK, you can register to vote from when you are 17, and it's super simple. It takes literally 60 seconds online and you're done. In the States, registration to vote varies state to state, so check your state's registration rules and just get registered. If you feel like your current administration is not working in your interest or aligned with your values, vote for someone who does. Yes, we know all lives matter. Let me be clear. When people say Black Lives Matter, they do not mean only Black Lives Matter. The statement Black Lives Matter is not disregarding the lives of people who are not black. Not all lives are being threatened and not all lives are being treated equally, so all lives cannot matter until Black Lives Matter. It's worth noting that people didn't start saying all lives matter until people started saying Black Lives Matter. The phrase Black Lives Matter and the BLM movement exists to end police brutality and racism towards black people. The phrase All Lives Matter was designed and exists primarily to silence Black Lives Matter. Does that make sense? So the people who say all lives matter, if they really believed all lives mattered, they would realize that black lives are being treated like they don't matter and be fighting to stop deaths of black people at the hands of law enforcement instead of trying to silence a movement.